Hello, this is Professor Zafari, and in this lesson we're going to talk a little bit more about modernism. And of course, it's Albert Einstein who is one of the most well-known physicists of the early 20th century. But what we see in the new developments of physics is that we're starting to understand the universe in a very new way. And one of the most interesting developments that happened early in the 20th century is when Einstein proves that Sir Isaac Newton's concepts are not always applicable. And this is a really radical notion that he presents because Newton's concepts, Newton's principles had become the foundation for physics. So to question them was really a dramatic innovation from Einstein's perspective. And so what we see then, Gloria Fiero explains, is that we have a very new approach to the concepts of time, space, motion, and light. Einstein's special theory of relativity really radically changes the way that we understand the universe. And then developments that add to these concepts, such as Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, further reinforce the idea that the way that time, space, mass are all relative means that there are some things that we're never going to be able to determine or to measure with certainty. That aspect of relativity will forever change the way that we think about the physical universe. Human beings had up till now functioned under the premise that give us enough time, give us the right tools, and we can figure everything out. And both Heisenberg and Einstein assert no, it's simply not going to be possible to measure everything with a degree of certainty. So with these new understandings of the universe comes a new philosophical approach to understanding our world or to understanding the cosmos. And what we learn is that nature is both random and relative. We live in a world that is not always going to direct things to work out in a certain way. It's simply indifferent. It's not a world in which good will always win over evil, in which the best for human beings is what will ultimately result. It's a world that is simply indifferent. Indifferent to humans, indifferent to outcomes, and indifferent to expectations. So let's look at one of the most famous poems of the early 20th century, Robert Frost's poem The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trod in black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Notice now the words that I've highlighted and that I've put in bold. Robert Frost is telling us there's two paths, and I have no idea looking down them what path will result in what outcome. So I took one because it was grassy and wanted wear and it hadn't really been trodden before, but both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. So here is a key point. Sometimes we perceive that Robert Frost is celebrating the road that is lesser traveled, but here he's saying both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. So there's really not a clear distinction on what path would be better. So in the end, this is the path he chooses. And is it then the better path? Perhaps. And so what we get from analyzing the poem is realizing this theme of the indifferent cosmos is very much apparent. It's not a world in which taking one path, a harder path, or the less traveled path, or the avant-garde, or nonconformist path is going to give you the better life. So it's that indifferent cosmos. It's not a pessimistic tone, but it's not a very optimistic, celebratory tone that's trying to moralize. It's simply indifferent. So 20th century poetry is a radical departure from the poetry of the previous century. And as we just saw, it reflects that concept of an indifferent cosmos. So to really understand this, let's take a look at two poems and contrast them. Invictus by William Ernest Henley is a very famous poem, and it was written in 1875. So this is not written very early in the 19th century. We're talking about a late 19th century poem. So we don't have a lot of the very flowery and embellished language that we would have in previous centuries. But there's still a significant contrast between this poem, a late 19th century poem, and 20th century poetry. So let's read this poem and then read a poem by a 20th century poet and contrast the two. Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. So let's contrast it now to a poem by a 20th century poet, Etheridge Knight. Hard Rock was known not to take no shit from nobody, and he had the scars to prove it. Split purple lips, lumped ears, welts above his yellow eyes, and one long scar that cut across his temple and plowed through a thick canopy of kinky hair. The word was that Hard Rock wasn't a mean nigger anymore, that the doctors had bored a hole in his head, cut out part of his brain, and shot electricity through the rest. When they brought Hard Rock back, handcuffed and chained, he was turned loose, like a freshly gelded stallion, to try his new status. And we all waited and watched like a herd of sheep to see if the word was true. As we waited, we wrapped ourselves in the cloak of his exploits. Man, the last time it took 8 screws to put him in the hole. Yeah, remember when he smacked the captain with his dinner tray? He set the record for time in the hole, 67 straight days. Oh, Hard Rock, man, that's one crazy nigger. And then the jewel of a myth that Hard Rock had once bit a screw on the thumb and poisoned him with syphilitic spit. The testing came to see if Hard Rock was really tame. A hillbilly called him a black son of a bitch and didn't lose his teeth. A screw who knew Hard Rock from before shook him down and barked in his face. And Hard Rock did nothing, just grinned and looked silly, his eyes empty like knotholes in a fence. And even after we discovered that it took Hard Rock exactly 3 minutes to tell you his first name, we told ourselves that he had just wised up, was being cool. But we could not fool ourselves for long. And we turned away, our eyes on the ground, crushed. He had been our destroyer, the doer of things we dreamed of doing but could not bring ourselves to do. The fears of years, like a biting whip, had cut deep bloody grooves across our backs. So immediately we can see that these two poems have very different writing styles. The language is very different. That's immediately obvious. Both poems are acknowledging the pain and suffering that life often brings, and they celebrate perseverance. And he's acknowledging here, under the bludgeonings of chance. A bludgeon is a really strong, blunt blow. Under the bludgeonings of chance, all of these chances and things that just happen in life have bludgeoned me, have just pummeled me, and my head is bloody, but unbowed. And in Etheridge Knight's poem, we get a very physical description of what Henley is saying with my head is bloody, but unbowed. So Hard Rock was known not to take no shit from nobody. He's unbowed. right? He's still going to be in charge. He's going to be master of his fate. He has the unconquerable soul. He's unbowed. And is his head bloody? Yes. But instead of this simple phrase, Etheridge Knight, in a very 20th century poetry style, gives us very significant, very sharp physical descriptions. He had the scars to prove it: split purple lips, lumped ears, welts above his yellow eyes, and one long scar. So we're saying something very simple here. My head is bloody but unbowed. But here we get a very physical, very tangible language to describe that experience. And both poems are celebrating the tenacity of these characters. So in Henley's poem, he says, "The menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid." And in Hard Rock's poem, as the other prisoners are describing his exploits, man, the last time it took 8 screws to put him in the hole. So clearly this man who is in prison, and clearly this man who is bound by a very rigid set of rules, is still unafraid. He's smacking the captain with his dinner tray. And he bites someone and infects them with his spit. And by the poem's statement of syphilitic spit, then he would have infected somebody with syphilis. So they're both in these very constrained circumstances, and yet they're both unafraid. They're both determined to be the master of the fate and the captain of their soul. So Hard Rock, up until the time where we see that he's taken away, is still remaining the master of his fate, the captain of his soul. But in the end, in this indifferent universe of the 20th century, Hard Rock's fate is outside of his control. It is the 20th century with its belief in an indifferent cosmos. So in Henley's world, the fact that he still remains committed to be master of his fate and captain of his soul means that that inevitably will be the outcome because of his tenacity. But in the 20th century understanding of the indifferent cosmos, that isn't always what happens. No matter how much Hard Rock was determined to be his own person and determined to stand for his dignity, to be the master of his fate, it wasn't simply possible with him. It was taken out of his hands. They bored a hole through his head and cut out part of his brain. And this practice of performing lobotomies or electric shock therapy was quite common in the mid-20th century. So by the end of the poem, we see that his personality is gone. And he had been our destroyer. We're still celebrating him. He was our destroyer, the doer of doing things we couldn't do. But in the end, it didn't work out so well for Hard Rock. So both really powerful poems. And what we come to at the end is that 20th century poetry is going to be really diverse. There's going to be lots of different language styles and tones. Some will be very physical, like Etheridge Knight's. Others, like the Imagists, are going to rely on more sparse language. But what we will see again and again is that much of 20th century poetry celebrates individualism, and we don't get a moral. This is not preachy poetry that's trying to impart upon us a moral. Just like Robert Frost's poem, "I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence." But he's not trying to give us a moral. He's not trying to establish for future generations what is the better road. And in order to express these new understandings of the world and these new individual expressions, we're going to see a very diverse development of language. Poets are going to create new forms to portray their experiences and their expressions. It's a century filled with lots of changes, and we can definitely see them reflected in poetry.